it's good to be going after those two previous talks, actually, because I'm going to be talking about how we create characters that have a complex, well-rounded set of abilities, and that includes the ability to have a back and forth conversation, but also a knowledge model that they're drawing from that might be structured in some way, also emotionality, also social cues. So to give a little bit of background about where I'm coming from, I started out as a games writer, or actually that's not even true. I started out as a PhD in classical studies, teaching Greek and Latin to students, and that is obviously why I'm here now. I was very interested in how we tell stories about people who are convincing, who seem that they have interiority and emotional responses to us, and that came out as a sort of study of Greek drama and things that I was doing in school. But I started writing independent games about characters like this, and so some of my early work was still very sort of classics-based. So Blood and Laurels is a story about being in the Roman Empire and poisoning people in order to claw your way to the top, which is kind of the good parts version of Roman history. But as I worked on that, I got into games writing, and I got into more and more into the AI that was needed to deliver the kind of experience I wanted to write. Because I found that if I was just writing dialogue, if I was just writing character responses, I wasn't able to get across the full dimension that I was trying to communicate of a character who would take on board what you said to them and form an opinion of you, so that the character was somehow reflecting back the person that you had portrayed yourself to be. So there's a real back and forth kind of connection with the character that you're talking to. And one of the early experiences that I had that kind of set me down this path was a game called Galatea, where you're talking to a statue who's been brought to life, and you're kind of interacting with her and trying to find out whether she's really a statue or whether this is all a hoax. And I had a player who wrote to me and said, during my playthrough, I told this character something that really upset her, and she was really sad and hurt, and I apologized to her, and that made her feel better. And that was the first time in a game that I've ever wanted to apologize to a character, or where the character understood when I did. And I thought, this is the kind of experience that I want to get at. We have so many games that are about running around and shooting people and doing these devastating, horrible things to them. And it's much more interesting to do emotionally devastating things to them, right? This is, I'm not here to preach about, violent games overall. I just want to take the territory of what we're doing in that space in a direction that's much more dramatic and much more emotional and compelling. So the more I worked on that, the more that led me into what can we do procedurally, what can we do with artificial intelligence, how can we model social systems of interaction, how can we model emotional systems within a particular character, relationships that we're having with a character. What are the ways that we can build that so that it's compelling for somebody to interact with? And how do we make players understand what they're even doing in that space? So that's kind of my mission. A couple of years ago, I joined a new startup called Spirit AI. It was started by a guy named Steve Andre, who came out of working on sales at IBM for Watson, so he had seen a lot of what was possible in the natural language space there. And we started talking about what might happen with bringing natural language, and then also some of the things that I've been working on as social AI and relationships, emotionality, and narrative AI together to make game experiences that had never been seen before. So Spirit works on two products. One of them is Character Engine, which is what I'm talking about tonight. The other one is Ally, which is looking at toxicity in human-to-human interactions in game communities. But both of them very much draw on natural language understanding and also understanding the social context of what people are saying to each other and what characters are saying to each other. So I'm going to kind of dive right in and sort of show you a little bit of what I'm talking about. Character Engine is an SDK that's built to plug into different game engines, the Unreal Engine, the Unity Engine, or a standalone C++ SDK, and it has an authoring tool that lets you create content that will feed into that. And so to kind of explain that to people, we built a demo that we took to GDC, which is the Game Developers Conference in San Francisco. And this is just going to show you kind of what a very sort of baseline interaction with this system can look like with the natural language side.
One moment, you're in the shiny suit. You're Gordo. right?
So what's going on here? We're starting out with a sort of space station scenario. We're talking to a character who's on board this vessel. She wants certain things from us. And the way that we set up this demo, we're seeing her kind of talking head speak to us. And what Character Engine is doing is taking the player's input, choosing what is the best match based on what we know about the situation narratively, where we are in the script, where we are in the story, and also the structured data that we have going on. And we're going to choose something to say back to you. And we're doing a certain amount of actual text generation as well. And then what you see on the right-hand side of that screen is actually a diagram of how that text is being generated in real time, because it's choosing substitutions based on what she knows about you at the moment. So we're just going to let this play for a moment. Or I think I am. There you go.
Hey, you, just a moment. You're a Gordo, right? Do it again and you're going out the airlock. Right, I'm Kara.
Okay, so what's happened here? You saw a first interaction with this woman. She greeted us, recognized us, spoke to us a bit, and seemed to be in a pretty good mood talking to us. Second time around, if as a player I type something that's rude to her, I say, "Hi, sexy," she's taking that on board as it's a greeting, but I also detected that that was a sexual come-on, and I don't like it. So she read that as kind of a social interaction that we're having. And she made a decision about how to respond to that social interaction that's based on her personality. So if you can see, I don't know how easy it is to read kind of at the back, but what's going on in that display is we're actually seeing she's got a bunch of different personality traits that reflect she has a dominant personality, she is trustful or distrustful towards us, and that is actually determining how she decides to react to social inputs that she receives. So she's kind of decided, I've hit on her in this way and I'm going to react negatively to that. So if we go on for a minute.
Right, Commander here, but what I need is more of a personal favor. Can you see what I'm thinking of saying?
So I say, why do you ask that?
The thing is, you're barely civilized, Mel. I've got a job for a person who won't mistreat a reader.
So what's going on here? She's carrying on with her story. She's trying to tell us a little bit of what she wants to get out of us. So there's a narrative sequence of beats she's following, but she's also interpolating into that names to call us because she doesn't like us, because we hit on her at the beginning of the scene. And that's going to kind of continue to play out in the way that she treats us. Every time that I type something into this scenario, what it's doing is it's recognizing certain entities. It's also running a whole sequence of natural language classifiers on that input, and feeding all of that information into our engine so that Character Engine can pick what the best possible response could be based on where we are in the story.
You're a reader. Is that true?
And so I'm going to keep being horrible.
I do not know quite what you have in mind.
And so if I keep on with this for a while, she'll keep trying to get us on side with her for a while, but the more I push her, the more she's going to get angry with me and stop trying to actually get along with me. Let me see if I can jump ahead in this video. I jumped ahead too far there.
Your database file didn't mention what a child you are.
So I've been rude to her too many times.
You're a waste of drinking water.
She has
and I've
limited
got to find
resources.
someone else. Bye, jackass.
So obviously we're still working on having a text-to-speech generator that respects our tagging well enough to deliver jackass in a truly, emotionally persuasive way. But you can see the language being generated there, and part of what is coming out of the Character Engine system is markup that's telling the lip-syncing animation and the voice production, deliver this in an angry tone, deliver this in an emphatic way. She's upset now, that kind of thing. So if we step back from the social angle and look a little bit at the kind of knowledge angle, let me show you a couple of other interactions. So I'm going to play again, this time treating her a little bit better, just a kind of more vanilla interaction.
I've seen your profile, data, citizen. Can you see what I am about to say?
So I say more or less. And she's going to start filling us in on the background of the
Thanks for
story.
outline. Readers will not usually volunteer who they are. I need to tell you something.
And all of her
Have you
lip syncing
heard of the
obviously is
Aeolian
being done in
Empire?
real time.
Hundreds and hundreds of ships, emperiled and dirt, heinous trade policies.
And so she tells us this backstory of what's going on in her world. Maybe I'm going to be a little bit cheeky here and say, yeah,
Right.
obviously, so she
Foolish
apologizes.
questions, I know, but some people come to marginal station from the other direction.
And so here we get an example of something that is quite contextual. You're asking about sort of knowledge in contextual moments. This system, it has both the structured database of information that she can draw on and the ability to interpret questions in the narrative moment that she's in. So she's just mentioned the other direction from marginal station. If I now say, well, what's in the other direction? This is a very contextual question, right? This is not something that would make sense if I asked it some other time in the story. But she's able to interpret that contextually. And now if I ask her another follow-up question, she's mentioned these sort of imaginary science fiction locations. If I ask her another question about that, she's now dropping back to her structured knowledge base.
If you do not want anyone asking any question.
She's dropped back to her structured knowledge base. She's found information from that. She's delivered that response. And then she knows that we're at a point in the story where things need to keep moving on. So she makes a transition. We see a transition node at the right side of the screen there. And then she's going to introduce...
Sensors have picked up an entire flotilla of Imperial cruisers heading to Marginal.
So she introduces the next important piece of information in the story, which is, hey, we're about to be invaded, right? I just told you about this creepy empire that's out there. They're coming our way. Okay, so 3 different layers of content here, right? We've got the social model, which is looking at things like me hitting on her at the beginning, greetings, insults, compliments, those kind of elements that exist in all conversations to create or destroy rapport, to create higher and lower status relationships between people. Those kinds of things have their default model and then the ability to kind of write extra content for them. We have the narrative structure, which is what are the beats that we want to deliver in this particular scene, and how could this scene end, how could that go? And then we have the knowledge model underlying that allows the player to break out of the script that you're in at any particular moment and ask some deeper questions. So what we're trying to address there is the gameplay situation. Sometimes we've got characters or players in games who are really interested in the lore of the game that they're playing. They really want as much backstory as possible, and they'd like to ask a lot of questions before they proceed to the next scene. And then you've got other players who are very impatient. They're just like, give me the quest and I want to move on. Right? And we want to be able to produce something that allows game studios to produce both of those experiences. All right, so what is the tooling for all this? We're trying to do several things here. One is we're building this in as modular a way as we can. We want to be able to plug in different classifiers, different forms of intent recognition, different NLU solutions. One of our baseline assumptions as a company is that we are not competing with Google. We are not trying to go out and do any of the things that the big companies are trying to do right now. Instead, it's about creating an authoring space that can pull those pieces together. And our authoring tool also allows you to plug in things that might not seem to be sort of obvious gameplay elements, because we also have clients that are interested in AR, VR, other kinds of entertainment experiences. So they want to be able to do things like, oh, I recognized a gesture that the player made in a VR context. I want that to produce a result. If my player gives a character the finger, they should have a response to that, just as if I had said something rude to them, right? So I need to be able to author that. And then also producing output with enough markup, so emotionality markup, pitch, tone, that sort of thing, that can be used to drive different solutions for real-time lip syncing and real-time text-to-speech. And as we've seen, the things that are happening in that space are really impressive. There's lots of really amazing work being done in text-to-speech right now. And we're not trying to solve that problem ourselves. What we're trying to do is make a system that can feed really powerfully into those solutions as they come online. And then similarly, a knowledge model database that can take in input either that was previously authored, so if you're the game author, you want to sit down and just write all of the lore content that is going into your game, as it was in that demo, you can do that. But you might also want to be able to bring in lots of external sources, RSS feeds, other kinds of material. You've got your own back-end content of some sort that you want to pull in. All of that we want to be able to make use of. So this is what our content creation tool looks like. It's the authoring tool for the experience that you just saw. And as you can see, it's divided up into elements where you're creating pieces of the plot. So scenes that you might interact with, and then quite a lot of interactions that might belong to just kind of free-form, things that the character should be able to answer at any time that you speak to them. But the knowledge model also lets you fill in lots of structured data about different kinds of fields, different information that the character should be able to answer questions about. And this starts out by default with an understanding of people, topics, and events, because we have a certain amount of sort of parsing built into the system to understand event-related questions and that kind of thing. But the individual user can expand that to include lots of different kinds of data and instructions about how to communicate that data. So if you say, I'm going to add to this database the concept of characters having age, and I want, if somebody asks this character a question about ages, then I want their answer to be expressed in a particular way. You can, in this part of the tool, you can write in, how do we talk about age? How do we answer questions like that? And as you can see, there's also room for a certain amount of structure. So in the first plot shot I showed, everything was fully left justified. But as you're indenting, that's just simply capturing the idea of dependencies on lines earlier on. So you can very easily kind of sketch in the structure of a branching dialogue without too much extra effort. But the player is still free to break out of that branching dialogue if you want them to be able to. So you can make dialogues where the player is really forced to answer a question. That's possible. But you can also make these branching structures where the immediately previous context is going to be understood, but if the player wants to, they can ask a completely unrelated question out of the knowledge model and still have a nice flow that goes forward. To give a sense of what it's like actually authoring the sort of natural language portion, part of what we've tried to do is make this system for game writers. Now, what game writers tend to be used to is writing in a lot of sort of highly structured, studio-specific tools, or else just in text documents of various kinds, but they're not particularly programmers. So they're willing to deal with a certain amount of formality and structure. Some of the time they're actually writing in spreadsheets, which is hell. So we're trying to make it a little bit nicer for them than that, but also try not to make them have to memorize or do any more metadata than they absolutely have to. So what happens when you're describing kind of what we call conversation mood? We don't use exactly the same language of intents that might be used in the chatbot space. But if I give an example, so as a writer, I say, an example of the kind of dialogue I want to respond to is, for instance, the question, where are your sensors? And when I type that into the plot view and press return, what the tool does is it immediately automatically runs the same set of classifiers and entity recognition that it would run on that input at runtime. And it comes back and says, this is what I recognize. I recognize that that was a question about location. I recognize that it was referring to these sensors that you've previously defined. Is that okay with you? And as an author, I could go in there and edit that and say, actually, you know what, I would be fine with this answering any question about where anything was. So I could actually delete some of those elements, or I could add more conditions in, and at this point I could add conditions like, I only want this to be the answer to the question if the player already knows about a particular entity, or I only want this to be matched if the character's in a particular mood. So you can apply a lot of additional conditions at that stage if you want to. And then on the output side, the other piece of this is we use an expansion grammar to generate the output text, so that there are lots and lots of possible ways for the character to express themselves. And this is really important to get across all of the emotionality of the relationship states that we were trying to communicate. There's no point in having a character who remembers lots of things about how you treated them if they don't reflect that back to the player from moment to moment. So we have to be able to do that in some way. You saw in the demo, her calling you some particular name being inserted into the flow of her dialogue. And this is the way that that is designed, so you can make lots of kind of branching grammar that can say, okay, if you're angry, I'm going to call you this name. If I'm in a dominant mood, I'm going to call you that name. And the tags, the information that goes with that about what emotion is being delivered, that all comes back out of Character Engine again. So if you want to have the surrounding game engine interpret that in a particular way or deliver angry lines in a particular style, you can do that. Okay, I'm nearly done if you're checking time there. So what does all of that have to do with the chatbot space? I think that there's kind of a two-directional thing happening here. One is that I think we're exploring some of exactly the problems that people have been talking about earlier. How do we do social bots? How do we do characters who have a persistent long-term understanding of their relationship with a player? How do we have characters who can reflect back how they've been treated over time? If you want to have chatbots that feel socially persuasive, they don't just need to have a certain amount of kind of writerly cleverness, they need to have that kind of responsiveness, they need to have a little bit of backstory, a little bit of narrative to them. And so all of those kinds of problems are things that are right in the space that we're working on and researching, with a combination of kind of social AI research, narrative AI research, and all of those things. And the flip side of that is that we're also really interested to learn from the craft of chatbot creators, because working in a natural language space, we know that there's quite a lot for us to bring on board about that. And so we're actually quite interested in having some conversations, possibly some consulting relationships with people who've made a lot of chatbots already, who can share what works, what doesn't work, and what they would like to see in a tool like this. So if that's you, please talk to me after. And that's it.
Thank you so much. It's fantastic.
Really impressive stuff.
Does anybody have some questions?
Lovely talk, thank you so much. Really interesting, and contextualizing it, it's really clear to me that you've got so much expertise that applies, and the time is now for people to learn about that. So I have a bunch of questions. I'll see if I can get the ordering right. I think one of them ties best with, there's two really parts. One is, do you see interest from the enterprise?
Yes.
And the second part is, what's on your roadmap? What's the things that you can't do now that you think is possible in the next kind of 12 months?
Right. So there are several different things. So our roadmap is partly affected by sort of specific client relationships that we have, but there's a lot of work that we're currently doing around, first of all, around localization, which, as you can imagine, is a huge, huge issue. So how do we even accommodate that? And that's something that we're putting a lot of focus into. Another is expanding our ability to dynamically summarize things that are in the knowledge model. So and this is something that in the game space comes up a lot in big multiplayer games where people in gameplay can be taking actions that then you want the characters to be able to talk about. So how do we add things to the knowledge model and then have the characters in an interesting, dynamic way, like summarize, this is what happened since last time you logged in, right? So there's work that we're doing there, but we foresee moving forward quite a bit in that space. There's also just a lot of work that we're doing right now about experimenting with plugging Character Engine together with different NLU solutions. So, what does it look like? As you saw, the kind of classification that we're getting in that particular example is comparatively simple, but we're exploring some things where we're doing more with Spacey to find out, was this the object or the subject of the sentence, that kind of thing. So that's in process right now. So those kinds of things. If there are other particular things you're interested in, though, I'm happy to discuss.
So one thing I wasn't especially clear on, is it statistical dialogue management or deterministic? And do you, it's like a hot debate in the kind of the scripting world, and where philosophically do you guys kind of fall on that?
So it's kind of our own special place that we've landed on that, which is that at any given, so on the natural language input side, and I should say, by the way, Character Engine has an entire other mode that you can use it in where it is offering a pre-formatted menu to the player where it's taking information from the engine about what it wants to make available. And that tends to be appealing to game studios that have fewer resources or are scared of natural language. But I figured for this audience, you want the natural language stuff. But with all of that in mind, there are cases where the designer really wants to be sure if this happens, that's the result. I want it guaranteed because this is a gameplay moment I need to sell. And so we have the ability to mark particular nodes in the narrative and say, at this point, let's really lock this down and say, like, no matter what the player says, like, one of these outputs is going to be the result. But the rest of the time, loosen it up a bit. And that comes into play both in terms of kind of scoring what we think the answer should be. So when it takes input, it's assigning scores to that input, looking at, what do I have available in this particular scene? What do I have available in the at any time part of the script? What do I have available in the knowledge model? And it's doing complicated things, which I wouldn't legally be allowed to explain even if I had time, but to like work out like what is the best match from there. And that bit is mostly deterministic, but there is then a fair amount of potential, sort of the text generation portion that results from that has a certain amount of probability in it. And then there are lots of things that can kind of subtly weight what's going on. And if, some of the time, it occasionally will score things the same weight and then it will choose randomly. So it's designed to make for experiences where if you play it multiple times, you will not have the same experience, but if there's something that the game writer really needs to have happen, they can apply a forcing to it. Is that?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Hi.
Hi.
It's kind of follow up to MDP, kind of is deterministic or statistic. When you actually mentioned about the knowledge model, you mentioned that the user can choose their own RSS feed and everything, they can do that. 65% of the time for any data scientist goes in cleaning the data and available in a proper context that can available to the policy to actually act on it. So in this case, if you allow the user player to choose their own RSS feed.
Okay, so sorry.
How do you actually control the data?
Sorry, that may have been a little unclear. When I said user in that context was the developer, the creator of the system. So as a game developer or somebody who was applying this in another context, like if you wanted to have characters in your game always know what the weather is and the player's location. But it's not just like the player can randomly divert information into it. The thing that's sort of closest to player-driven content creation like that, though, is we have had a number of conversations with clients who are really interested in modding, and I don't know if you're familiar with what that is, but basically like giving their players a toolkit that would allow the players to create their own characters at a certain level. And so then the question is like, how much of the full sort of content creation toolbox do we want to make available to individual player authors? But there again, it's likely to wind up being, here's the structure you need to fit into for obvious reasons. Yeah.
Do we have more questions?
So I have two questions. One is the player always a single player? Or is there more than one player in a kind of team or multi-team or whatever? Talking originally about games where people go around killing each other, lots of stuff like that. And personally, even though I'm into martial arts, there's lots of people, guns and knives, all that shit. I personally find the games for all that stuff utterly boring. And then the second question is whether the player is a protagonist or some other West role in the overall story.
Okay, so two questions. One is, does this have to be a single player experience or can it be multiplayer? And second, like, is the player always the protagonist or are they kind of an onlooker or a sidekick to a running story? Yes, I've got it. Okay, good. So the answer in the first case is handling multiplayer better than we do is on the current roadmap. So right now, what the system does is model a conversation and it will treat inputs from different people as though it was just one stream of space, as it will be shortly. So that's an area that we're developing in. And one of the things that potentially comes out of that is the ability to have characters where, like, you could actually effectively play good cop, bad cop on a character, right? Like, you could have one player that they liked and one player they didn't like, and, have a conversation, where they're responding differently as a result of that. So that's a really interesting space where we're kind of trying to build up what we're doing there. But there are some interesting challenges around that, especially when you get into 3D environments, because, and this probably doesn't arise with chatbots really at all, but one of the challenges is just like even knowing who all is in the conversation, how long have they been part of the conversation, do they have the entire dialogue context, did they come in partway through, do they need a recap, do we need to talk differently because they need a recap? So there's a lot of stuff like that, this kind of edge case that we need to improve how we handle. The question about whether the player is the protagonist or whether they're kind of coming onto a story that's already happening around them, that's really up to the individual designer. This is a tool, it's not saying you have to present the player in a positive light or even that you have to center the player in a particular way, but it is assuming that the conversation that is written allows for the possibility of a player. One of the other things that we're moving towards, though, is creating more support for NPC to NPC dialogue, which I think kind of gets towards what you're thinking of, like having characters who can interact with each other. Now, the interesting design challenge in that space is that if you have NPC to NPC dialogue that happens when no players are present, then you can get behavior in the system that looks like it's buggy even if it's not. And what I mean by that, I had a previous system, this wasn't Character Engine, but there's a previous system that I worked on where in debugging, we had a player come in, meet some people for dinner, and then after dinner he met a third character who'd not been at the dinner. And that third character, player character, never met this person before, but he was a doctor. Immediately the doctor was very rude to him, instantly. And the guy who was playtesting was like, well, this is clearly broken because this guy is treating me like he thinks I'm a jerk and I've never met him before, so something must be going wrong. Well, what had actually happened was the player had offended somebody else. The somebody else had gone privately to the doctor off stage and said, hey, this guy's a jerk. So the doctor had a negative opinion when he first met the player. So it wasn't a bug, it was the system working. It was the system working in actually a really cool way. But because the player couldn't see that, it felt like a bug. So there's this extra sort of challenge of, if you make a really simulation system where the characters can speak to each other off stage, how do you communicate what's happened to the player in a way that still feels like this is a good experience and not just super confusing?
Thank you so much. Is there anyone else, or is it that? Sure.
Hey. So yeah, super interesting, this whole storyteller AI stuff. Just two questions. One quick one is, in terms of the CMS that you showed to the nuts and bolts, in your video, you have essentially a visualization of the modules and makeup. So is that part of is that just a visualization, or is that part of kind of like a node-based compositor essentially that you can use?
Yeah, so it is, you don't use that node-based system to build the dialogue, if that's what you're asking. But it is visualizing, it is accurately visualizing what the structure is that the grammar flow is following.
Okay. And is there any sort of interest in building something like
that? No, making that visualizer part of the actual tool is something, or something like it, is something we've talked about.
Yeah,
and
I've seen it in the market.
Yeah.
And then I guess the last thing is just in terms of, you're pulling different MLU providers and different services, like you said, so you're kind of essentially like, the single view of, the whole ecosystem. So so I guess you're kind of, because you're deconstructing stories and really looking at the semantics and coming up with all these different emotional tags and stuff like that, do you see yourself almost like as the guardian of storytelling? Because how do you standardize that across the different,
Right. That seems to be inviting me to give a very hubristic answer that I will regret later. But no, I think there is a role that is open for someone to fill, and we are attempting to at least help with filling it, which is about kind of understanding what goes between all of these different services. Like, what is the space that, between the input and the output, and how does design even, of experiences even work in that space? One of the things that we found is, a lot about what NLU you want to use really depends on how much sort of setup the character is doing and what they're telling you and what the likely responses are. So you often can kind of direct the player a bit, and how much you're directing the player is going to affect what kind of input you want to understand and how much detail you want to understand it in. So yeah, I think there's a lot of kind of knowledge to build in that space, and I at least want to be part of that.
Thank you so much.